Protesters who instigated brawls and threw rocks at police outside Milo Yiannopoulos' Melbourne shows could face charges. The divisive alt-right commentator has labelled the violence an attack by the left against free speech. Mark Santomartino reports.
Punches fly
Nazis are not welcome here!
As protesters turn violent, beating each other with stakes and flags until the riot squad steps in. Dragged away with force,
Don't resist. Understand?
bloodied instigators were treated behind police lines, spurring on hundreds from the left-aligned campaign against racism and fascism.
No Trump! No KKK! No fascist USA!
Surrounded on all sides, hundreds of riot police formed a perimeter around a small contingent of True Blue crew members, carrying pro-Trump banners and spewing anti-Islamic insults. Worked into a frenzy, 5 officers received minor injuries and 2 protesters were arrested after rocks and bottles were thrown.
We have a culture of protest violence in Victoria. Daniel Andrews needs to restore the law.
The Move On laws were never about public protests. They were never used for those purposes.
All this over the sold-out shows of a man hated by his critics as a racist and misogynist, who today walked into Canberra's Parliament House.
Shame on you. You should not be welcome here. Disgusting.
On Senator David Leyonhjelm's invitation.
What feminism has become since it's run out of things to complain about is a mean, vindictive, sociopathic, man-hating movement. Our new friends from the Middle East refuse to integrate. They shouldn't stay here. I don't find that to be a particularly controversial position, but apparently it is.
The bloke's just a tool, and I wouldn't waste any time on him.
On his way to Sydney for more shows, Mr Yiannopoulos labelled Melbourne's left-wing protesters petulant babies. And while no one in last night's crowd has been charged, Victoria Police is threatening to take action.
Over the years, you get to know many of these protesters, so we'll look and see if we can identify some people, and if necessary, we'll take action.
Mark Santomartino, 9 News.
Good evening. The violent clashes that erupted at a Melbourne speech by right-wing commentator Milo Yiannopoulos have been condemned by police. 2 people have been arrested and the hunt is on for more culprits, following what senior officers called a disgusting display.
Regardless of your religious beliefs or political views, it's hard to see how this sort of violent behaviour can be justified. Police were used as target practice. Young men living in the Flemington flats pelted the public order response team with bricks, bottles and rocks.
We had several hundred police involved in the operation last night. It's a drain on our resourcing.
Earlier in the day, a heavily outnumbered far-right contingent clashed with the far left, who were there to protest controversial commentator Milo Yiannopoulos. Police say they're disgusted by the actions of the protesters.
Both sides need to probably have a good hard look in the mirror at themselves.
Blair Cottrell from the United Patriots Front says the far right did nothing but defend free speech.
Who's inciting violence though when a right-wing speaker wants to give a speech, has his own event, rents out his own hall, but then people come to that event deliberately to try to shut it down with violence and intimidation? Who's the aggressor?
Tess Dimos from the Campaign Against Racism and Fascism says not them.
They came carrying big flags of supporting Donald Trump, and they were flags that were held up on wooden poles that they then used to try and attack our demonstrators.
The man they were protesting was in Melbourne for one night only. Milo Yiannopoulos spent today in Canberra. The handful of protesters there were far more civilised.
You owe them an apology for your disgraceful comments last night.
Shame on you. You should not be welcome here. Disgusting.
I think he's a ridiculous individual. I think there's no particular brilliance in coming out to Australia and saying offensive and outrageous things.
I think he's able to outrage people who I think are silly, the Greens, lefties in general.
After speaking in Canberra today, Milo Yiannopoulos' controversial show then heads to Sydney tonight and then onto the Gold Coast later in the week. No doubt police in both cities have been paying very close attention to the violent scenes we saw here in Melbourne yesterday.
2 people have been arrested for attacking police, but there could be more. CCTV will now be reviewed to see who else was involved in the violence. And the venue which hosted the event will be getting an invoice from Victoria Police. Michael Scanlon, 7 News.